Is it really true, as Adam Smith says, that if each person pursues their own self-interest, the result is maximizing the welfare of the entire community? In other words, if each of us pursues his or her own good, is the result of that that we collectively produce our own good, the good of the entire community? Well, under certain circumstances, yes. However, there are circumstances where things can go wrong. The most commonly discussed one is something known as the tragedy of the commons. It's actually a form of something called the prisoner's dilemma in game theory. In my organizational ethics class, I talk a lot about that. In fact, we have a big chunk of the course that's devoted to game theory, and the prisoner's dilemma is a key part of that. But here, I don't want to talk about that in the context of game theory in quite the usual way. Instead, I want to think about the tragedy of the commons in a more intuitive way. Here's the idea. There are certain circumstances where each of us can pursue our own good, given what other people are doing. But nevertheless, the result is something bad for the entire group, or at least, let me say, suboptimal for the entire group. There would be better outcomes that we could all attain, but only if we work together. So how might this happen? Here's a classic case, a community of shepherds, of sheep farmers. They're raising sheep, and each has their own private pasture land, but there is also a common pasture. Nobody owns it, it's something held in common. Anyone can graze their sheep there. Now, I think about this situation, and I think, well, yes, my sheep are going to be a little happier, a little better fed. They're going to do better if I can graze them some on that common pasture. And in fact, the more I can graze them on the common pasture, as opposed to my own private one, the more the sheep will end up getting, because they'll have all the grass from my private pasture, but also what they're able to graze from the public land. And so I've got an incentive to allow my sheep to graze on the public lands, and in fact to do that as much as I can. Well, of course, each other sheep farmer has just the same incentive. They want to graze their sheep on the common land as much as possible, so that their sheep do as well as possible, getting the grass from their private lands in addition to that common land. Now, what's the result? Well, we are all trying to graze on that common pasture as much as possible, and we ruin the pasture. We are all, as a result, worse off than we would have been had we limited the amount of grazing on that common pasture, enough so that it would sustain the amount of grazing that was on it. If the sheep graze too much, they eat all the grass, there's nothing left, it can't support the grazing anymore at all. I want you to imagine then that each of us faces a choice. I can graze my sheep only a little on the public land, mostly grazing them on my own private land. Or I can graze them quite a lot on that common pasture. What should I do? Well, I don't know what you and the other farmers are going to do, but the difference my own particular sheep are going to make is insignificant. So I think, look, suppose you all are going to graze only a little bit on the pasture, then actually my sheep can afford to graze there quite a lot, and I'll be better off the more they graze on that pasture, so I'll graze them there quite a bit. After all, it's to my advantage if you guys aren't using it all that much. But suppose you are. Well, the additional damage that my sheep can do, again, is insignificant. And so it looks like, well, look, it's going to be ruined anyway. Might as well get what I can while it's still available. So I am going to be better off grazing my sheep a lot on the common land, no matter what the rest of the farmers do. But every farmer thinks that way, so we all graze a lot on the common land, and we destroy the pasture. To bring out what this has in common with the prisoner's dilemma, imagine that there are only two of us. If one of us grazes our sheep on the common pasture, and the other doesn't, that farmer is better off, but the pasture can sustain that, it's okay. If, however, we both graze our sheep on the common pasture, it's going to suffer. Maybe it won't be worthless, but nevertheless, it will be much less productive. So each of us thinks, what's best for me is that I graze on that common pasture and you don't. But of course you think, well, yeah, what would be best for me is if I graze on that and you don't. And so we're both going to be in that position of those being our best outcomes. Now, second best for each of us is where we graze a little on that common pasture, enough so that our sheep gain some benefit, but not so much that we start deteriorating the pasture. The third choice from each one of us is where, well, we both graze on that common pasture, but then we reduce its effectiveness. At least we get a little bit from it. The worst for each of us, I suppose, is where the other one takes advantage of the common pasture and we don't. Well, as a result, if we think about the decision we're making, I can think, okay, if you're going to graze your sheep on the common pasture, I'm better off grazing mine there too. It will deteriorate the pasture, but on the other hand, at least my sheep will get a little of the benefit instead of none. Suppose you're not going to graze on the common pasture. Well, then that grass is just going to go to waste and nobody's going to benefit from it if I don't. So yes, I should send my sheep out there. So no matter what you're going to do, I should send my sheep out onto the common pasture. You think the same way, so we both do it. And the common pasture suffers. It's less productive than if we had shared it and limited our grazing on that pasture. Well, that's a situation then, when each of us can do what seems best for us, given whatever the other person's doing. But the result is not an optimal outcome for the group. We could jointly do better if we limited our grazing on the pasture. There are plenty of situations that do seem like tragedies of the commons. Classic cases are air pollution and water pollution, but there are many, many others. Is a tragedy of the commons of this kind, based on the structure of a prisoner's dilemma, the only kind of circumstance where it will turn out that each of us pursuing our own self-interest does not lead to the best outcome for the group? No, there are other situations where that can happen too. Now, some of them we're going to discuss later, involving just us not knowing what the situation is and making mistakes and a variety of other things. But there's one other that emerges in game theory that's a very clear case of how this can happen. Now, in this other case, it doesn't have to happen by any means, but it can happen. It's called a stag hunt. And the classic case is this. Several of us are going to go out hunting. We could hunt a stag, or we could hunt rabbits. Now, there's a lot more meat on a stag than there is on a rabbit. So we're going to do best if we all cooperate. But it does take the cooperation of all of us to bring down a stag. They're hard to catch, and we have pretty primitive weapons. We're far back in the history of hunter-gathering, let's say. It's easier to catch a rabbit, but it's also much less useful. And so we go out in a hunting party with the idea being we're going to get a stag. We're going to try to cooperate and circle it and do the kinds of things that primitive peoples might have done in order to catch a large animal. But now it's only going to work if all of us, or at least the vast majority of us, stay with it and continue that encircling process. If some of us drop out, if some of us say, you know what, I don't think this is going to work, we're going to go home hungry, I'm going to break off from the group and go hunt a rabbit for myself. If people do that, then we're in trouble. And so here's the situation. If I cooperate and am part of this group to get the stag, then if everybody else cooperates, awesome, we're going to get the best outcome, or at least we've got the best chance of the best outcome. But if one or more people break away, we're not going to be able to do the circling at all, and we're going to lose out. And so really, if other people can't be trusted to participate in this exercise, the best thing to do is just forget about it and go off and hunt the rabbit yourself. Consequently, in this sort of situation, there are two outcomes that are quite likely that are what game theorists refer to as Nash Equilibrium. One of them is one where we all cooperate and we all hunt the stag, but the other is one where we all decide forget it and we break off and hunt rabbits. We're much better off going for the stag than we are going for the rabbits. Nevertheless, it can easily happen if we don't trust one another. So in that kind of situation, a stag hunt situation, we can get a different kind of tragedy of the commons. Basically, through being a low trust society, we can end up in a suboptimal equilibrium. We can end up being in a situation where we are not doing as well as we could jointly, even though each is pursuing their own good individually, because we don't trust other people to cooperate with us. If we cooperated, we could do better. But if I can't trust other people to cooperate, I'm better off just doing things on my own. Now, there is an obvious economic significance, an analog for each of these. In a tragedy of the commons situation, we're each pursuing our own good, but we're imposing costs on other people, basically. My sheep are doing some damage to that pasture, they're using it up, they're causing some level of deterioration. Up to a certain point, it can naturally replenish itself, so it's not really a problem. But beyond that point, it can't, and the pasture starts suffering. This is what economists refer to as a negative externality. I'm imposing costs that affect other people in pursuing my own good. And so the pursuit of an activity that promotes my own good but leads to negative externalities for others, basically harms or risks of harms to others, that becomes a problem. The stag hunt situation is different. It's not that my pursuit of the rabbit harms other people if they're also pursuing rabbits. That's fine. However, my pursuit of a rabbit, when I've agreed to be part of the party hunting the stag, that does hurt them. And so there the problem is really one stemming from a lack of trust. Why are we all going to decide, oh, we'll just go for rabbits? Because we don't trust the other people. So it's not so much that my individual activity imposes negative externalities on others. Instead, it's that we are not in a situation where we can trust other people and so cooperate with them to get good outcomes. Well, in a free enterprise economy, that might manifest itself in a variety of ways. I may not trust you to fulfill your part of the contract, for example. I may not trust that you're actually going to perform the service that you've agreed to perform. I might not trust that you're performing it in an adequate way. I might fear that you're doing it with substandard materials, or you're telling me that I need X, Y, and Z when I really don't. So I might not trust you to fulfill your part of the bargain. If it's an investment consideration, I may fear that actually you're not going to invest the money the way you say you are, or that I'm investing in something that is not actually going to produce anything of value. So distrust can become just as serious a problem for a free enterprise economy as negative externalities, the imposition of harms or risks of harms on other people.